All right, we're going to have some, if the conversation's anything like it was in the green room, we're going to have some fun with this one. So super broad topic, talking about securing data at the edge and at rest, and zero trust, and all the things zero trust. So we've got a lot of room to roam around here. First, we're about 18 months after, post M2209. Really what we want to talk about is where are we in terms of current state? Are we really in a better state from a security perspective? Are we working towards that? And really just from a structure perspective, like we talked about, just wander around the topics that you want to hit home with. So whoever wants to start there.
I'll jump in. So
Yeah.
let's go. So I think that federal agencies are all digesting what's in the strategy. I actually think it's one of the better written documents that I've seen, because it gave some real clear paths to take in terms of focusing on consolidating identity, kind of putting a gravestone over the VPN, really trying to take some pragmatic efforts. But I think there's a lot of work to be done in terms of really thinking about, are we just going to go move around the pieces on the board, or are we really talking about this as a fundamental architectural shift that affects everything from what we do at the transport layer all the way up to applications? And I think to realize the outcome that I think was envisioned, you have to get all the way up to the top of the stack. And so really being able to envision where you position those decision points in the architecture and how to tag data, how to consolidate identity. Those are things that agencies are really grappling with. We've made some good progress, I think, on the network pillar, if you took the CISO model, in terms of kind of abstracting the crunchy outer layer of the organization. I think there's a lot of work to still be done up at the top of the stack in terms of having applications really being able to enable themselves to take advantage of shared identity, and frankly, gaining consensus across an organization on what that shared identity model should be for an organization. And so I think there's a lot of work to be done, but we have a pretty strong strategy in my mind. It's just a function of executing on it and laying out the approach and the projects that will get us incrementally towards the goal.
Yeah, I'm going to chime in and say I think I heard the word architecture in there. That's something I love to emphasize when we talk about zero trust and M2209. I think really took the opposite tact, right? If zero trust is a broad architecture and we need to move our entire enterprises or data environments and think about that from a holistic perspective, M2209 provided real crisp guidance with respect to actionable things we can do to move towards that architecture. And you mentioned VPNs, right? So that's like a zero trust anti-pattern. And we like to focus on what can we do to move away from that as quickly as we can, because that is really a concentration of trust in a single resource often. That is a ripe target for exploitation. And a zero trust model will hopefully get us away from that. And that's a great thing that that memo emphasized as a step forward to that. And it was replete with steps that we can take immediately. Some of these things are initiatives already in progress, so we can continue to leverage. But that still leaves a huge gulf now in completing the rest of that architecture and really bringing zero trust to other aspects. You mentioned progress in the network pillar, and I think the network space we had a head start on. People have been talking about zero trust networking for some time, but now we're trying to figure out how to do that in these other domains. Data is, I think, the next big one, right? That's the core of what we want to protect, and figure out how to apply, say, identities with respect to data and in some unusual environments, edge environments where identities, networks, data are all distributed. And we don't really have good ways to do that today, and we're still trying to figure that out.
That's right. No, I think that's exactly it. And you talk about it as an architecture, and that is what it is, right? There's no magic bullet. I can't go out here and buy a pound of zero trust. And sometimes I think different agencies are going to have different paths to get there. But the point is that you're fundamentally saying, hey, I'm not going to have any place where I concentrate that trust in the environment, and I'm going to verify every transaction against every resource. And I think that's a pretty powerful model, but it's a big lift. And so one of the bigger challenges for large agencies is how to build consensus on how to get there. Because it is in terms of being able to change the environments that people have built for their particular mission, or being able to decide what pieces ought to be provided at an enterprise level across all of that, and which pieces can be left to an individual agency. So there's as much in the social sciences of this in terms of building consensus as anything.
Organizational transformation,
Yeah,
and those
absolutely.
types of things, right? So we talked a little bit about challenges, and just want to give you the opportunity to explore some of those challenges. Just pick one, and then we talk about kind of what we either think should be done about that challenge, whether we're making progress, whether you've particularly in your roles seen some successes in that space. But let's explore a little bit of the challenges associated with whether it's securing the data, right, or zero trust as a whole.
Yeah, I'm going to say we talk to a lot of folks within the government about how they're implementing zero trust. You know, as a vendor, everybody is asking for solutions. Give us the magic bullet to zero trust. There isn't one. That's the real challenge. Is getting away from this idea that there is a singular solution to this. As an architecture, zero trust is everywhere, and we're going to build distributed systems, distributed trust models. Currently, the biggest challenge is just understanding within our enterprises where those roots of trust are, where our assets are that we want to protect and our data assets. Right. Even before we get to this idea of tagging or understanding how to control the distribution of that data and creating explicit trust, we just have to understand where we have implicit trust today. Going back like M2209, sometimes is really obvious, right? Our DNS, we're not even securing our DNS. So let's start there, the real obvious things. But there's still this huge challenge of figuring out all those places where we have implicit trust, and even systems that we think are relatively secure. You look at like PKI, for example. PKI, you think, well, that's about as explicit as you get. I've got a certificate, I've got some keys, there's an issuing authority. But there's lots of implicit roots of trust, even in that kind of an exchange. Your client machines and your tokens that are holding those keys, those are all potentially vulnerable. And they might be vulnerable in different ways, depending on where we're at. That's one of the difficulties of operating in, like, for example, edge environments, where the hardware, the operational model, the key distribution mechanisms, all those things might be different. And we might have to adapt to how we do that in these types of environments, and come up with new or innovative ways to do that and tie that into our zero trust access controls.
Yeah. So I think you talk about the edge computing piece, and I think the biggest challenge that I see really isn't from the perspective of an M2209. It's kind of like what NSM 8 came afterwards and said, apply this to the national security systems and apply this to some people would consider mission IT or platform IT. But it still has the same challenge in terms of a zero trust architecture, but perhaps harder because of the nature of those systems and the way they're deployed. And to your point about edge systems and the complexities there in terms of whether it's PKI or otherwise, it's a much more challenging architecture. So I'd say that from a challenge perspective, it's that construct of the systems that typically don't fall into the category of an IT system, but that collect, store, process, and distribute data. Still under the purview of a CIO, still under the purview of a zero trust architecture, but much more difficult to implement.
Sure. And you mentioned that sometimes it's not an IT system. So we always talk about the human-oriented controls and control systems and organizational controls that are also the challenge, especially as we move towards more autonomous systems, AI-based systems, these more distributed systems at the edge where humans aren't in the loop always, and we have to create that explicit trust where there aren't humans in the loops. There's, for example, our key distribution mechanism has to be robust enough that we can rely on the IT systems that hold that key material And that might be something that we have to learn to give up, in the reliance on those human controls and rely on some of those IT system technological
Yeah, I
controls.
mean, the whole idea of, say, AI is probably key to our success in that, is our ability to develop means of training models and testing the resulting application of them and performance of them to gain that trust. Something that we're still learning about, I think, but the explosion of AI now has certainly made that a priority.
Yeah, absolutely. AI, I think, is going to play a critical role in how we build our systems in the future, because Zero Trust, among other things, demands us to look at the full context of every transaction, right? And the more we look, the more context we can uncover, and the more we can pull into those decision points, and make more accurate and informed decisions about granting or denying access to systems.
So let's talk a little bit about structure, right? We talked whether it's guidance or whether talked a little bit about risk management and kind of the approach and realizing that the structure has to exist in order to achieve the objective, right? So the question is, do we have everything that we need from a structural perspective, whether that, again, is either guidance or general practices or just the appetite to actually achieve it. Curious on your thoughts on whether the structure exists to set us up for success.
You're all looking at me. So, you know, I think it does. I mean, there's nothing inherently new about what we're talking about doing. It's just the pace at which we can do it and the scale at which we can do it. Mm-hmm. So how much resources, you know, what are we going to, I think to me, I look at it and say, here's a perfect opportunity to say, what are we going to stop paying for because we want to do this other architecture? That perhaps is the most challenging conversation to have with a stakeholder, a mission owner. But being able to articulate why it's important, the fact that one breach and the cost of that, or the reputational risk of that, or the practical mission impact of that, has to be in the calculus. Mm-hmm. So how lucky do you feel? I think we're trying to get to a point where it's not going to be relying on luck, but that conditional access that's based on multiples of factors to determine whether a transaction should go through or not.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the other, aspect of that is this idea that we have all this legacy infrastructure. And I know we talk about this, but we have legacy infrastructure, legacy processes, legacy people that we can't just wish away. We have to, that's what's protecting us today. We have to continue to prioritize that. I think we heard a moment ago the word cyber hygiene come up, and I know we talked about that a little bit ourselves. And that's still an important aspect. And we still have to get better and improve on that, even at the same time as we're thinking about the future and that target architecture that we want to get to.
I think that the cyber hygiene piece is still relevant. Like, I always love using the example, and I'm not trying to say that compliance is the end all, right? It's not. That's not why we're in this business. We're in this business to understand the risks and manage them. But I still don't want the airplane pilot taking off without doing the checklist, right? So there is table stakes in cybersecurity is if you're going to manage risk, you need to understand what the risks are. So compliance is a tool for being able to understand where you're carrying risk, which is what we've been trying to do in terms of cyber hygiene, in terms of not self-attesting or self-assessing, but being able to go take the information from industry and bake it into some algorithms that give us a maturity score, which we can use as a surrogate for risk, because there's lots of factors in terms of risk, in terms of threat versus the vulnerability's existence. But can I actually see what the required maturity of a company's cybersecurity is for the complexity of the work they're proposing to do? Seems like a pretty good risk management approach.
Right. Sure. Right. And risk management is all about understanding the context which you're operating. Right. So the more you understand that, the better. And that's something that everybody has a part to play. The real challenge is, those supply chains I think we're discovering are far more complex than we initially assumed, especially in the IT world. And as an open source company, we see the complexity of like the open source supply chain.
Right.
There's millions and millions of open source projects out there, millions and millions of developers. And as an IT provider, we don't even control most of those resources. And our job is still to protect our downstream users from that, and to some extent hide that complexity, and prevent that from bleeding through and provide that single point. But regardless, we can't just wish away these complex supply chains, and we just have to, again, deal with that reality. Manage that risk as by understanding what those look like, and then providing as much protection against that supply chain as we can.
Sure.
In terms of risk management, so we talked a little bit in prep about, are we measuring the right things? Do we, again, kind of back to, is the mechanism, or are all of the mechanisms capable of really applying that context and giving those risk officials or folks making decisions on risk the right information, especially as we move towards zero trust? One, is it satisfactory for now? Do we see it fundamentally changing in a zero trust world? But let's just explore risk management a little bit from that perspective.
Yeah, I think I'll jump in there and say that the risk management in the zero trust world is in some sense simpler, right? The zero trust is built around a model of trust but verify. You don't actually trust anyone until you can see the data, look at the context, and then you can make your own determination. And you don't even actually have to, the model says you don't have to rely on somebody else's assertions. That's just one piece of evidence, and you have to independently verify that. Right. So.
And as we move towards that, though, how do we, it's supposed to be, we're supposed to be making these decisions at speed, right? So how do we move towards where we don't have to have someone making a decision about risk?
Yeah, I'm going to say that's all about the data, right?
Exactly.
Context is fundamentally about data and collecting the data about the environment you're currently operating in. Yep. And this is why things like CDM are going to be incredibly important to collect that data, CAV, and other tools in our toolbox to understand what the current threat and risk environment looks like, as well as things like vendor attestations, understanding our supply chain, understanding the impact of downstream effects. So say you don't trust an upstream system and you turn it off, like how does that affect you? Like what's the cost-benefit analysis of accepting some risk?
I think that's fair. Certainly, in my mind, what zero trust does is pushes the risk management a little bit higher, right? So now I'm talking about what combination of factors. Let's say conditional access to a resource. Do I care about geography? Do I care about time? Do I care about some other factors in terms of making that access decision? And that's going to be, as we've talked about here, predicated on having the data to make those decisions, being able to understand that this person whose identity has been validated logging in from California and Beijing at the same time might be a problem.
Right.
Yeah. Right. So how do we understand that data? How do we have that telemetry? How do we make those decisions, match that up to provide that conditional access?
Yeah, and I kind of mentioned too, the value of that access, right? And the other trick will be understanding, and we don't also do a good job at this today, is what is that access being requested for? And what is the business function or mission function it's serving? And can you appropriately balance that risk? So it's not just understand the risk, it's then managing that risk as well.
So let's talk about the edge a little bit. I know you wanted to chat a little bit about that. What do you see the role of the edge in zero trust?
You want to go?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, edge is.
Can it do all the things, or is it just one little piece, or is it?
I think it depends on how you think about the edge, right? So I tend to think of it as we take the cloud model and apply that everywhere, and that's really what edge computing is about. But of course, if we're doing this everywhere, means that we're going to be doing this in places where we don't have a full context suite. We don't necessarily have trusted identities. We might have to reestablish trust. We might have to do all sorts of things that we might have to do, say, in our core enterprises. And that's really the challenge of zero trust is in these environments is now you really have to understand what that risk calculus looks like in these different environments and what's going into that in order to make those decisions.
Yeah, I think and the edge can mean different things in different missions as well. So whether it's a refugee seeking asylum, trying to interact with someone, so that external identity, or is it an agent trying to go get access to data from a UAS system? So it goes both ways. It's internal, and that's the reason I say that it gets more towards identity starts to become kind of the keystone in all of this, and two aspects of that, internal and external. But I think that the challenge for those edge systems that we talk about is that they don't have the compute capacity. They don't have the connectivity that you would normally expect to robust infrastructure, particularly in some of the places that we operate by necessity, whether it's at the southwest border or a disaster site with FEMA responding to a natural disaster. So we naturally have a resource-constrained environment. That's probably going to be one of the areas that we have to move a little bit more cautiously to figure out a solution, or maybe there's more than one way to get there. But I think that is part of the risk calculus. At the end of the day, the technology is about supporting the mission, not the mission supporting the technology.
Right.
Yep.
So let's talk current events, software supply chain and supply chain in general. How do we see that? How do we see ourselves making progress, but from both industry and from the federal government, from both of your seats? How do we see improvements happening in that area?
Yeah.
So go ahead. I've seen great strides here in terms of what we are doing in DHS. Some of that was driven by my experiences coming in January 2021, right as SolarWinds was kind of at its crest, and thinking through what is a supply chain risk management, what's a cyber supply chain risk management supposed to do with this, right? So we developed a four-pronged strategy to get after it. The first prong was how do we go assess the critical software? So really calling up the officials at SolarWinds and saying, hey, let's sit down, let's talk about what happened, and then what are you going to do about it? Right. Let's figure out what happened and see whether we can move forward. And then figuring out what does that look like? I put together a federal assessment team that went in and started looking at these critical products and giving an assessment of the maturity for us to make some recommendations. The second prong was how did we get after the cyber hygiene? So we got industry all over the place delivering critical missions, a lot of them for DHS being small businesses. So how do we start to understand their ability not only to defend themselves, but to be a partner in responding to some incident that happens in the DHS environment? So we started to work down that path with the cyber hygiene assessment with industry. The third piece was due diligence on the products that we buy. So really just surveilling the technical reference model for DHS, starting to understand, hey, what were the issues associated with whether the company has started outsourcing their development, or whether there are issues associated with a product that might flag us to look more closely at it. And the fourth prong, I think probably one that's has the greatest potential, is really lashing up the pieces of DHS. So if you did make the decision you wanted to go pull something out of the environment, you better be talking with your contracting officer. You better be talking with your money person. Right? You probably need to be talking to your legal counsel. So how do you start bolting up the pieces of the organization to respond to something like that? So those were the four prongs in the strategy. I'd say that we're making pretty good progress on all of them. But to the specifics of the software, I think that M2218, the OMB memo M2218 is probably the elephant in the room, right? Because it basically says, and the National Cybersecurity Strategy, which is kind of saying, hey, let's put the responsibility for the security of these products that the government buys on the people most closely able to influence it, right? The people who manufacture.
Right.
So M2218 says, okay, software manufacturer, attest to the government that you've used the NIST secure software framework, software development framework to build your product. And oh, by the way, have an SBOM in the wings in case something bad happens. All right. That's a pretty tall order. But, and I know that we've talked a little bit about that, so I'm going to toss that one your way.
Yeah, I mean,
Tee up.
so from an industry perspective, it is an absolute tall order. But we have seen that energize industry, and there's already talk about S-bombs, for example, even before that memo and before EO 14028. The industry has already seen like, well, we can improve our process. We can provide things like S-bombs and provide greater assurances. But it's still a huge problem. And even extremely mature organizations have a huge amount of work to actually provide that capability, to provide attestations, to regularize their processes, whether internal or upstream or others that affect their own supply chain. And it's, again, a very complex supply chain. So there's suppliers of suppliers, and that reach extends very broadly. It is absolutely valuable to do that. And one of the, I think, more interesting things that we have in the future ahead of us, though, is these kind of assertions, say an SBOM or attestation, they only get you so far. SBOMs, I think, are a great example of that. What do you do with an SBOM? There's been a lot of talk, well, it's just a document, you can't do a lot with it. Or can we use that as part of vulnerability management? And there's a lot of work towards that. But I think we're going to see both the challenges of using that sort of data as part of context and making risk-based decisions, in the sense of making, using that in the right way, so that we don't make assumptions about, say, how something works or how secure or relevant something is based on those kind of assertions. And again, it's an assertion, it's not a guarantee. And then what can we do in the downstream sense? Like SBOMs, I think, are an example. Like, we're going to probably find lots of relevant use cases for how we can take advantage of SBOMs in the future that we haven't even yet explored, right? So we're focusing on vulnerability management, and that's one aspect of that. But there's likely to be all sorts of others as well. Maybe as part of a identity framework, that assertion in an SBOM hash tells you something about what you are and what software you're operating with, and can you use that to your advantage. Same thing with a dependency analysis, right? So if you want to understand what the impacts of your critical infrastructure are, that might be a tool in your toolbox that can help you do that. But these things are yet to be explored, I think, and we, as an industry, need to help facilitate that, but also understand what those limits are. That's still an imperfect set of information, and you can't take that meaning too far and rely exclusively on that. And again, going back to vulnerability management, vulnerabilities come in two forms or several forms, right? It's the known knowns and the known unknowns. You know that you're going to find 0 days, that things are going to be found after the fact. And all the attestations and all the SDL in the world can't necessarily protect you against that. And you're going to have to manage that in a cooperative and responsible fashion for that downstream use, so you can update and patch, and again, update those IT systems or software systems to correct those issues, even after they're discovered after the fact.
Yeah, no, I think I would agree that the vulnerability management seems to be the natural nexus as a kind of a first start, right? To be able to say, hey, something's come out that's new, unknown. Where does it exist in my environment? And how do I get after it to understand, hey, am I diverting resources to search for a needle in a haystack, or am I actually searching for a known instance of something that needs to be patched in my environment right now based on a threat?
Yep.
All right, let's shift a little bit and go back to kind of organizationally, how do we do this? Let's talk about competing priorities and all the things that, from both industry and you've got to respond to the federal requirements. Both of you do. So how do we, any thoughts on how you navigate this world of so many competing priorities? What do you focus on? How do we gain traction in that environment?
I think certainly, certainly the most effective way that I can find is to kind of look at their high value assets. How do you start with the most valuable things to your enterprise? Begin there. Start to understand what the landscape is. And then I think the other end is how do we start to make sure that as we're acquiring new systems or start building, that we bake those constructs into the requirements up front. So I spent a lot of time looking at the requirements of the Executive Order 14028 associated with multi-factor authentication and encryption and rest and encryption and transit, kind of the things that, that Director Easterly talked about in terms of the EO. And the challenge is we still have legacy systems out there that are just not going to be able to get there. So at what point do we call the ball and say, hey, we probably need to redo these systems, rework them? Which is a little bit of what my boss, Eric Heisen, CIO for DHS, talked about in his Senate hearing in terms of IT modernization. How do we start to go provide the foundational enterprise services and the capabilities to allow us to modernize rather than necessarily sustaining things that are never going to meet our requirements? And I'm probably paraphrasing a little bit about what his intent was, but the ground truth is that when you're carrying 30-year-old technology, you can spend all the money you want on operations and sustainment. You're still going to be carrying 30-year-old technology.
Yeah, the challenge there too is at the same time you have to carry that O&M for all that legacy technology. We have all these new mandates. We have threats that continue to evolve. I mean, the reason we're focusing on supply chain isn't an accident. It is because we're seeing the threat landscape rapidly evolve and accelerate. You know, there's a 700% increase in supply chain attacks in the last couple of years. And at the same time, you know, we have things like transformative initiatives like Zero Trust that are pulling us in priorities. Now, in some cases, forcing us to look at, you know, that cyber hygiene and things we should have maybe been doing before, securing our DNS, for example. And then we have threats on the horizon that we know are coming. Post-quantum cryptography is a big one. And I'm glad you mentioned encryption, because encryption is how we protect everything. And the entire modern world today is every financial transaction, every health record, every trust exchange is moderated and managed through encryption technologies. And if we don't get ahead of that, it's going to be too late. And these kind of things are not just going to force us to update and modernize our technology, but also, again, change how we do things. And we better get ahead of that curve. At the same time, we take care of our, you know, cyber hygiene and O&M.
So we give you guys a warning. We're going to open it up for questions here after this one, but I do want to explore encryption a little bit. What do we need to? You mentioned staying ahead of it. What are your thoughts on where we need to focus in order to get closer to ahead of it?
Well, I'm going to start by saying just encryption everywhere, right? You know, the fact is that we have a lot of systems out there that we just don't operate in an encrypted fashion. You know, one of the, you know, going way back to our early part of the discussion, M2209, right? It's start using HTTPS, right? I mean, this is like basic, like just encrypt things wherever we can. And this is Zero Trust because, again, like we can't rely on that perimeter defense anymore. And the more we can take advantage of our encryption systems, our key management, and other technologies like that to manage our trust model, the better. But again, that's just a start, right? That's going to get us to, you know, step one, and then we have to look forward to things like crypto agility, post-quantum encryption, things like more sophisticated key and trust management systems in order to make that happen.
I think you hit upon one point there I think is really critical is as programs are building out is really making sure that they're maintaining that cryptographic algorithm agility, algorithmic agility to kind of change up. You know, in my past, I dealt with a particular DoD radio system, right, that was able to go take in the new algorithm with the, you know, new cryptography. Problem is you had to ship it back to the company to have it done, right? So, you know, how do we avoid that kind of thing? That may not be the best way to go do that potential requirement. So being able to look at how you're building products to make sure that I can change out that algorithm without breaking the whole system down and having to send it back for OEM maintenance. I'm going to use maybe an older term, but I think that's probably the key in the near term, because we don't even have any approved algorithms yet for post-quantum. We're probably, as was pointed out, it's everywhere. When you think about the post-quantum problem, the challenge is that you can't look at too many things that aren't affected by it. So how do you prioritize that? And then when will algorithms be available for purchase and integration? And so I think really being able to, again, prioritize based upon when algorithms are available and prioritizing those systems that you can. But then there's other aspects of M2209 and of the executive order. You know, one of the simplest way to keep yourself from getting hacked is to implement multi-factor authentication.
Right. Yep.
So, you know, sometimes the best way to not get hit is not to be there, right? Not to let them even get in.
Right.
But I think really that crypto agility, algorithmic agility, is going to be a key trait.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned MFA, because that is, and you brought up identity earlier as kind of central and becoming a real focal point for Zero Trust. And this is, again, going to be one of the challenges for, say, implementing Zero Trust or moving these trust systems into the edge environments, is how do we, again, manage MFA? How do we do things like identity management? You know, if you're going to rope in credential management as well into that. So how do you manage keys? How do you manage tokens and things of that nature in these edge environments? And I think the real challenge is, in going to like the O&M comment, is these systems that we deploy today, they might be in existence for 30 years as well. And so if we're not implementing, say, crypto agility into these systems, if we're not implementing robust systems for distributed identities or distributed trust systems today, we're going to be stuck with those for 30 years. And so to the priority aspect, it's like, well, your high value assets, your high value systems, maybe what you should be looking at, but also those systems that are going to be deployed in the field or in use, or where you have implementations in hardware that are hard to replace, right? We can't just take every sensor we deployed in the field and ship it back to the factory. And so we kind of have to start at those systems now and prepare for that future today.
Yeah, I think certainly we're at a point where thinking about Zero Trust as an architecture, really being able to go into the forethought of how we procure those edge-based systems with that in mind. You know, and gaining some consensus, going back to organizationally. Right. How do you start to build consensus around the architectural context? So I'll go systems engineering 101, right? It's the functional allocation, decomposition, right, down to the functional baseline and then into the product baseline. Mm-hmm. How do you get agreement on that functional allocation so that you can, you know, kind of have those provisions for that flexibility at the edge in the future?
No doubt.
That decision happens now.
Yep.
Good stuff. You guys ready to take some questions?
Yeah.
We've got 5-ish minutes left, so questions? Got one over there.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Amanda Broadnax. I'm a consultant as well as studying cybersecurity. I've worked in the military and the government for a number of years. I would like to hear you guys' viewpoints on cryptocurrency. Specifically, sorry for a kickback from the mic, dealing with fintech companies, the risks that are associated now that a lot of these large brokerage and banking firms are getting involved in crypto, just the impact that you see in the private sector, but also on the government side as well.
Question?
Yeah.
I don't know that I would offer. I don't know that I could offer you too much in that regard. I mean, I think from a larger mission perspective in DHS, the impact of cryptocurrency and particularly how it's being used in illicit activities is certainly something of great concern. You know, particularly in the human trafficking arena and in things like fentanyl production. So I think having an understanding of how that works and what the mechanisms are for supporting civilian agencies' ability to disrupt that chain is probably the most critical. I will say that I'm not seeing a tremendous mission adoption of cryptocurrencies. So I would probably be limited in terms of what I would offer there, but I think certainly our understanding of it and the mechanisms that are out there for us to disrupt the trade is the key factor for us.
Yeah, I'm going to jump in and say I actually think it's interesting to watch the cryptocurrency system evolve, and I think there's a lot of potential lessons that we can draw from that. I mentioned like distributed trust and distributed identity models a moment ago, and the interesting thing is we're watching the cryptocurrency markets essentially figure out how to solve that problem for us. And that's essentially what cryptocurrency is, right? Your trust is essentially your wallet ID or whatever it happens to be for your system, and that's your identity. And you're seeing, these malicious actors that are or criminals using these markets to hide their tracks and figure out how to operate, while say other agencies are trying to hunt them down and trace transactions and identify the real world actors behind those. And I think we're going to learn a lot of lessons from watching that happen about how we can then use that to build our own distributed trust models and operate against threat adversaries that might, be trying to exploit our models. And I think, I'm interested to see how that evolves. Things like how can we avoid, tracing if we're going to use some kind of blockchain technology for identity management or some kind of key management system. How we can avoid or prevent or use things like mixers or cyber scrubbing and things of that nature to essentially provide additional cyber protections on our end. So I'm excited to see how that shapes out in the future and what we can learn from that.
Good stuff. All right, very good.
Good afternoon. My name is Mike Smith. I'm a retired acquisition guy, so I'm not really a technical person, but I've been working in the cybersecurity arena and purchased a lot of this capability over the years. With an increased reliance on AI and are we doing enough to really protect the data? Even encrypted data gets hacked. Are we doing enough to get ahead of that? Because if we're going to rely even more heavily, as we discussed earlier, on AI to protect our systems, what are we doing to protect the data that the AI is listening to?
No, I think that's at the heart of the executive order's mandates around encryption of data at rest and in transit. But to AI, right? There is still a lot of work to do to determine how we want to take on board AI and how we develop up the training data that's relevant to make that a capability for our missions. But there is the other side of it is how we use AI to, or how an adversary might use AI against us, which is really what I think you're getting at, right? And I think that is a challenge. Of course, the first step is don't let them get to the data, right? Right. So that's what all this is. That's what we're talking zero trust about. Is the best way to avoid getting hit is not to be there, right? So don't let them get to the data. That's why I get kind of interested in when I have these small percentage of systems that we have that still have gaps in encryption at rest and encryption in transit, and frankly, multi-factor authentication. That's probably the biggest thing, right? We still have 80-some percent, 83% of exploitations are due to human error. So, if you can cut off that, now you can have your cyber defenders really looking for those folks that are using the advanced techniques against you. So I don't see us having. I think that the AI is the impact of AI. I'm going to be careful here with what I say here. The impact of AI is probably greater if I can get to an unencrypted data set. Because what I see happening there is this ability of an adversary to build very sophisticated phishing campaigns that are extremely realistic, that leverage not only what we traditionally see in terms of email, but also forms of video and audio to actually build a campaign of contact and build trust with an individual to the point where when they get the link to go hit, they don't even think twice about it. That's the risk of AI in my mind in a near-term sense. And the more data that the adversary has to build that realism, the greater that risk. So I don't know whether I'm answering your question or not, but to the point that I don't see us, I don't see us having huge issues with massive data sets being hacked. Certainly OPM was probably the biggest one in our experience. But I think that what it does is it punctuates, AI punctuates the need to be even more diligent in how we protect the data that we have.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We're running, one more. All right, we got time for one more.
I have to choose.
Sorry, Nathan.
Yeah.
Hey, Frank Sandover, Microsoft. I have a question for you, Michael, because of the open source role that you play in the industry, all the good stuff you do. Companies like Microsoft and Red Hat, we have the resources to meet these regulations, right, over time. We have the money to invest, to work on them, right? So would love your perspective on smaller businesses that are open source companies that are effectively crowdsourcing their code and stuff, that are supporting the federal industry. What's the impact? I mean, are they going to start bailing out because this is just going to get too hard for them to do? They don't have the money and resources. So much of the government depends on open source. So just kind of understanding the perspective for a large business that's in this field, operates very well in the field. How do you see kind of the smaller businesses playing?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's it's a challenge even for, I'm sure, Microsoft as well to meet these. So yeah, of course, our small businesses are hugely impacted. Now they might have a narrower and more concentrated set of concerns that they can tackle. But yeah, I'm sure they're overwhelmed. When we saw this with CMMC, for example, right? The industry, I don't want to say revolted, but they're like, wow, this is a lot of stuff for us to have to do and to pivot against. So I think, and I'll go back to risk management, right? It's like still a risk management approach. One of the things that's, I think, great about the open source community is the open source community tends to gravitate towards solutions that everybody can get on board and reuse and extend and build on. And so I think, for some of these smaller vendors, I think there's a golden rule in open source, which is like somebody's already done it, right? So I'm hoping, this helps, the open source community understand that they can leverage their, the fabulous routes they have for collaboration to essentially collaborate on achieving these same ends, right? As a community and essentially build, on their own collaboration, on their own backs, the capability to deliver, secure by default and attestations and all these other things that can help us protect our supply chains. And I think, the main issue is they need to be incentivized to do so. And mandates aren't going to be the only thing that does it, right? And I think I heard this comment earlier. It's like, where's your budget, right? And where's the priority? And when we see people starting to pay more for secure by default or solutions that we can provide those attestations for, then we will accelerate that process, and that these smaller businesses and the entire open source industry, I think, will respond accordingly. So we have to create those appropriate incentive structures for the industry to do these and not just rely exclusively on mandates.
Very good. I think that's going to be a wrap. Thank you for all of you joining today. Thank you, Mike, Ken. Appreciate it.